Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In this one we're going to be playing 3 different games against players in the rating range of 2100 and above in chess.com's rapid rating pool. And we're going to be playing different games focusing on our Ready Nimzo Larsen approach. It has been a little while since I've made a Ready Nimzo Larsen video, but I did say I was still making videos on it. So I do want to give you guys some more game examples featuring this opening. At this moment as well, there is a Christmas sale going on with Chessable, so if you're interested in checking out the course that I've made on the Ready Nimzo Larsen on Chessable, then you'll want to be able to check that out since it is on discount right now. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the games here. Alright, so we've got our first game here, playing knight f3 for our Ready Nimzo Larsen approach. We're going b3 on move number 2. Depends a little bit on what black does, but let's see what they decide to go for on move number 2. They do go for d5, which is one of the most common moves. We go for b3. Put the bishop on b2, and then we'll kind of decide on where we're going to play or develop our f1 bishop too. Now, when black goes for this particular move order, as we've seen in other episodes of the speedrun series that I had, this particular video isn't necessarily part of the speedrun series, but the main, I would say, kind of important point to consider here is we actually want to play the move pawn to e3 in this position. We don't want to play bishop to b2 and allow black to play moves like f6 and e5. We're going to play e3 first. That way, if black plays f6, we can play d4, and if the pawns are traded, we maintain a pawn on d4 that stops black from playing e5. Now, once they play knight c6, we're just going to continue with bishop to b2, and then we're going to go for bishop to b5, and mainly we're fighting for control of these dark squares in the center of the board. We are probably going to make the capture on c6 in the near future, but I'm not really planning to make that capture until black kind of encourages us to take the knight. I'm going to wait for them to waste a move with a6 first. That being said, I'm going to castle right here. And they go for g6, which is kind of an interesting order of moves. Now, the drawback to g6 is that now the knight on f6 is pinned, and even if black plays bishop g7, the knight will actually still be pinned in that position. So what we can do in this circumstance is actually go for the move pawn to c4, striking at the pawn on d5. We're threatening to take it right now again because the knight's pinned. Black should either take our pawn or play e6 or something like that. If they play e6 though, it's usually not great in a lot of scenarios to combine the moves e6 and g6. You do weaken a lot of the dark squares in your position. Instead though, black does decide to capture with the pawn. We can take back with the bishop or with the pawn. I'm leaning towards taking with the pawn, so that we can play d4 in the near future and have 2 pawns in the center of the board, or at least 2 pawns across the 4th rank of the board. Taking with the bishop is playable as well, but we're gonna we're gonna take with the pawn to gain more space. So black plays bishop to g7. I suppose we can go ahead and play the move d4. This was kind of our game plan here. If black takes, we'll take back with the pawn, and just play with our space advantage. Maybe we can even play a move like pawn to d5 to gain more space. We're also potentially threatening to just simply take the pawn on c5 if black does nothing about that. I would assume they're going to take the pawn. And we will most likely be recapturing with the e3 pawn in that situation. So we're about 25 seconds behind on the clock, which is not too much at this point. We've got a space advantage. I think our position's a little bit more pleasant so far. But black is relatively solid, though the lack of space is, a little bit uncomfortable in the grand scheme of things. So let's see what they decide to go for. They are taking their time thinking through what they will do. I think they pretty much have to capture the pawn. I'm not really sure. I suppose you could move the knight off of f6. That way there is a pin. If they move the knight, they're the ones pinning the d4 pawn. However, if you move the knight into the center of the board, it feels like you're just asking to be attacked. Maybe I'd go knight c3 or knight d2 or something like that to harass the knight that's in the middle of the board. Even queen to c2 protects the bishop and also attacks the knight on the e4 square. That also looks pretty good. Not completely sure what they are considering other than taking the pawn. Again, if they castle, I don't know if I would take the pawn or push. Taking the pawn has some benefits, of course, that I win a pawn, but it's probably not easy for me to hold on to that pawn in the long run. Whereas if I push the pawn after they castle, we gain more space, we kick the knight, maybe we trade off the light square bishops, and then try to continue, expanding from there. So they do decide to go for the move knight e4, which is a little bit surprising, to be quite honest with you. I think I'm leaning towards queen to c2, because again, not only am I attacking the knight, but I'm also protecting the bishop. And if I'm protecting the bishop, then I can play the move d5 or take on c5 afterwards. I don't necessarily want to trade off this knight, because I feel like the knight on e4 is a bit more of a liability than a strength, I would say. So if I go queen to c2, if black moves the knight away, I very well may just capture the pawn on c5 and attack the knight. They take the bishop. I can either take back or I can take on g7 first, like black would have some problems to solve there. If they try to protect the knight, maybe they push the pawn, then I can still play pawn to d5, and I think black is in a lot of trouble there. And if they play bishop to f5, which is the only other way of protecting the knight, I think I would, even there, still go for the move d5. And I think black has trouble based on the knight on c6 being pinned and stuff like that. So I am going to go queen to c2. And I think that black has a hard time dealing with both of these threats at the same time. Because not only does d5 attack the knight on c6, but it also opens up the discovered attack towards the bishop on g7. And even if black trades the bishops and I take back with my queen, I will still be attacking the knight, as well as even the rook on h8 in the corner. So yeah, I think black is actually just losing material here, as far as I can tell. Now the question is, I can take on c6, I can play d5, and I can take on c5. And is one of these better than the other? Okay, so let's first look at taking the pawn. So if I take the pawn, I'm attacking the bishop on g7 and the knight on d6. If he takes my bishop, I take with the queen. I am then attacking the rook in the corner, as well as still attacking the knight. And I don't see a way for black to save both pieces. If black first takes my bishop on b5, I can take the bishop, I can take the bishop on g7, attacking the rook, and still attacking the knight. Even if black moves the rook to counterattack my bishop, then I can take the knight on b5, attacking the knight on c6. And I'm up a piece at that moment. Even if they take on g7, I take on c6, and I'm still up a piece there. Now, is there anything else black can do? He can throw in bishop f5, I suppose. But after bishop f5, I think I can just play a move like maybe even just queen to c1. And I'm still attacking the d6 knight, still attacking the bishop on g7, still protecting my bishop. And then once again, I don't really think there's a way for black to save everything. So I'm leaning towards taking on c5. I'm not really seeing any problems with that. It could be the case that d5 or taking the knight first and then taking is also good, but I'm really not seeing a problem with taking c5. And I think I'm going to just pull the trigger on that. If this was maybe like an over-the-board classical time control game with more time on the clock, I would probably look at taking the knight on c6 or playing d5, or taking the knight on c6 then d5, or taking the knight then taking on c5. But at this moment, I'm not really seeing a reason as to why my first variation I was calculating would be bad to go for. And so, oh, okay. He actually just ends up resigning. I was going to take back on b2, attacking the rook in the corner, as well as attacking the knight, and he was going to lose a piece in this position. Okay, he ends up resigning before I could pull it off, but okay, we were in a winning position nonetheless. The computer says +4. We will go into the game review and check it out, though. But yeah, look at this. I mean, we won a game against a 2100 rated player in 11 moves playing already Nemzo Larsen. So that's a pretty good endorsement of the opening. Yeah, so let's go into the game review. We'll check this one out here. All right, we played at a 94.9% accuracy to our opponent's 75.2. We did have one inaccuracy, but our opponent had two mistakes, one inaccuracy of their own. Let's check things out. Apparently, my middle game accuracy was somehow 46.1, which is kind of crazy. uh, not really sure how that works, considering I got a 94.9. Okay, we'll go through it move by move and see what happened. So the game goes knight f3, d5, b3, c5. e3 is an important move to play in this position. I've mentioned this in other episodes or videos focusing on the ready Nimzil-Larsen. As a quick note here, if you do play the move bishop to b2, black can play the move f6, trying to play e5. And the only way really to slow down the move e5 is to play d4. The problem is, once black takes this pawn, we don't have another pawn to recapture with. And no matter which piece we do recapture with, black is going to get those two pawns in the center, which is something we generally want to avoid letting them do. So it's important to play e3 first, because now if black plays f6, then we play d4, and this time we can recapture with the pawn and prevent black from playing e5. Okay, so they didn't play f6 though, they played knight c6, bishop to b2, knight f6, make the pin, black breaks the pin, castle, g6. I go for the move c4, attacking the pawn on d5 because the knight on f6 is pinned and not protecting it. Even if black plays bishop g7, we would still take the pawn since the knight is still pinned in this situation. So instead, black decides to take the pawn. I take back with the b pawn. Taking with the bishop is probably fine as well, but I do like having the pressure on the knight. There are still some situations where we will take the knight and then play knight to e5. For example, if black plays a6 here, I would go ahead and most likely take the knight, and then play knight to e5, threaten to take the bishop and mess up black's pawn structure. Probably they'd have to do something about that, maybe something like rook to c8. We eliminate the bishop, and then we can continue from here. Taking on f6 is apparently pretty good, because if black does take back with the pawn, you are going to get full control over the d5 square, which is a nice outpost. And if black takes with the rook instead, you're still kind of asking to be attacked over in the queenside direction, and black is kind of behind on development, which is not that great. Anyways, though, black played bishop g7 instead. We go with d4 to grab space. Knight to e4 was a mistake from our opponent. We go queen to c2 to attack the knight. The knight goes back to d6. And yeah, apparently the computer does slightly prefer the option of taking on c6 instead. I did mention during the game that quite honestly, I didn't really feel the need to invest a lot more time to consider taking on c6 when I did see that taking on c5 was already pretty good. It ends up that after taking on c5, black actually does have the option of playing knight to f5 to guard the bishop. I do think I actually kind of missed that this was an available option. But regardless, we're still up one pawn. We still have the ability to kick black's pieces around. Rook d1, knight c3, trade bishops on g7 if we want to. White is definitely still significantly better in this position. But the computer does seem to prefer capturing on c6 first. I think the reason is that if the bishop recaptures and then we play d5, we are kind of... It's more forcing, because instead of attacking the knight that can move to f5 to guard the bishop on g7, we're attacking a piece that cannot really do anything to protect the bishop on g7. Here we would just be winning material. If these guys trade, we're hitting the rook and the bishop, and black loses a piece. If black takes with the pawn instead, then we take on c5, the knight still goes to f5. I guess it's a better version of things, because e4, I think we're just winning a piece here once again. We hit the rook, we hit the knight, we're ahead material. I guess that e4, let's see, so if we take here and then play e4, I guess this version is not as good because black can use the knight to go to d4, which is part of the reason why taking the knight on c6 first would have been a bit better. But okay, slightly nitpicking here, I suppose. Like I said during the game, if I had more time on the clock, I would have given more consideration to the other options of taking the knight and pushing the pawn. I ended up playing the second best move, but it was still more than good enough to get a large advantage, and our opponent took on b2. He resigned before I could recapture. After taking back on b2, we have a significant advantage, and it is definitely lights out for black at this point. We're going to either win the rook on h8 or take the knight on d6 and be up a lot of material. All right, so that's our first game, though. Let's get into our second one at this point. All right, we got game number 2 here with our ready Nimzil-Larsen approach. We're against Good, rated 2176 from Norway here. So knight f3, knight f6, we go for b3. Put the bishop on b2. Okay, they go for c5. We go for the move bishop to b2. Knight goes to c6. Now, in this particular arrangement of things, in terms of figuring out where we're going to develop the light square bishop, because black has committed the knight to the c6 square, I am going to go for the move pawn to e3, especially because if we go e3 and black plays d5, we play bishop to b5, and we pretty much get the exact same position that we just saw in the first game. If black doesn't play d5, then we'll kind of work around that. But let's go for e3 to begin with. And we'll see what black does in terms of how they commit their pawns at this point. They've got the two knights out, but how are they going to do the pawns? They do play the move d5, and so we play bishop to b5. Very, very common position you'll have when playing this opening. You'll have this in a lot of games. I've had this a bunch in the speedrun series. We just had it in the very first game a moment ago. And again, the game plan is to potentially double up the pawns on the c-file by capturing the knight. Knight to e5 will apply pressure to the knight on c6 that's pinned. Our opponent goes bishop d7, same approach we just saw in the previous game. We're going to just castle the king once more. If they go g6, just like the other game, we'll go c4. If they play a6, we will take the knight. If they go e6, I'm leaning towards just going ahead and taking the knight anyways at this point. I will say that e6 is probably a better move than a6 because it's a little more productive at the end of the day. It is also perfectly fine, I will say, to not take the knight in this circumstance, and you could even just play a move like d4. If black exchanges the pawns, maybe we drop the bishop back to the d3 square later. We may not necessarily need to be in a rush to make this capture on c6, because you really only want to make the capture on c6, number one, when you're provoked to do so. So, like, again, if black had played a6, I would have most likely made the capture. Or you want to make the capture when you are going to be able to kind of guarantee that you can mess up black's pawn structure. Here, there's definitely no guarantee that that would occur. Even if we traded on c6 and played knight e5, they can always play a move like rook to c8 to protect the knight. So I think given the circumstance, I'm actually going to veer a little bit in a different direction and play the move d4. And the idea here is that if the pawns are exchanged, we will drop the bishop back to the d3 square later. And the big concession that black has made here is that they've played the move e6, which means that their bishop is not going to be able to develop outside of this pawn chain. So they play queen c7. I think I will just go ahead and play knight to d2. I don't want to capture on c5 until it's a bit more useful, I would say. I kind of want the dark square bishop to develop somewhere first and then take the pawn. That way black has to burn two moves, moving the bishop twice in a row. If I take the pawn right now and they take back, then they're just going to, not have a problem. They'll have moved the bishop only once instead of moving it twice. Now, I may take here at the right moment as well to open up the bishop to hit the knight, but right now the knight's protected, so that's not really a whole lot special going on there. So knight to d2 is the move I'm leaning towards. I could also go pawn to c4, which I think is very reasonable. And maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll actually go for pawn to c4 here. I'm kind of liking the look of this a little bit more. Part of the threat now is that I do want to take c5, and then I can then take the knight on f6, and then take the pawn on d4. And so I think I can go for that here. The question is, does the move order matter here? Because all of this queenside play feels a bit odd, I will say. I mean, they're still not developing the bishop on f8. I think he didn't want to move it 2 times in a row is my assumption, but... So the question is, if I take on c5, if black takes back with the bishop, I think I'm very happy. I eliminate the knight, then I take on d5, and I think we're just up a pawn in that case. However, if I take on c5, black could take on c4 first, and get rid of the d5 pawn kind of problem, you could call it. That being said, maybe I can do this in a slightly different way. If I take on d5 first, if the pawn takes back, I take c5, and we're in good shape there, I think, because we have that bishop takes knight idea. If black takes with the knight, I can still take on c5, and you can't recapture without losing the g7 pawn. So I think I'm going to take d5 first. I'm assuming he takes with the pawn, but I'm not sure if he would maybe take with the knight instead. pretty much regardless of how he recaptures, I'm going to take on c5. That's my game plan. And then we're going to unleash the power of our kind of Nimzo Larsen bishop, you could call it. Another option is to play e4, kick the knight, and then play d5. That's also a very interesting way of playing, I will say. Especially when the king is still stuck in the center. I kind of like the look of that. I do like the look of that approach. So e4, maybe knight goes back, d5. If the pawns get traded, then I can check on the e-file, and I think black runs into some big king safety issues there. If I take on c5, that also looks good too, quite honestly. If the bishop takes back, I take on g7, the rook moves, I keep my bishop safe. The slight issue there is I'm not sure, like I do win the pawn, but I'm behind on development, and the rook on the g-file is a little bit scary, I will say. A little bit scary. So I think I'm actually going to go for this e4 approach. e4, kick the knight, and then play d5, and try to really just blast open the middle of the board, using the fact that black's king has not castled yet. If I can open up the e-file, that would be fantastic. We'll see if that ends up happening or not. But let's see first of all what black does about the e4 move in the first place. If the knight goes to f4, I might have d5 and then bishop to e5 ideas at some point in the future. But mainly here, if the knight moves, I'm going to play d5. Or not, well, not really if the knight moves, but when the knight moves, I'm going to be playing d5. That's my main idea at this point. So what will black do about this? I think the fact that black has held off on developing the dark square bishop for so long is going to lead them to trouble, because they're not able to castle next move. Even if they had a free move right now, they would still need to move the bishop before they could castle. So they're not able to castle right away, and so we can try to take advantage of that by attacking here in the center. The knight does need to move. There's no counter-attacking ideas that work if black plays a6. I can either take the knight on c6, then take the knight on d5, or take on d5 and then c6, and I'm going to win a piece either way. So the knight needs to move. I assume the knight should go back to f6. If the knight goes to b6, it feels very far from the king's side, which is going to be a bit concerning for them, I would say. Maybe knight to b4 is also available, but then always the move a3, kick the knight to a6, and that still looks pretty bad for black. The knight on a6 looks really, really misplaced. They do end up playing at knight f4, which I don't think is all that great for them. Mainly because now the bishop coming to e5 in the future will fork the queen and the knight, which I think is going to be a big issue if they're not careful. So I'm still going to play d5. I could take on c5, but then again, if I take on g7 and they play rook g8, my g2 pawn is a problem. So I have pretty much no plan to take the pawn on g7 at this point. I really just want to play d5 and open up the position. If the knight moves, bishop e5 is maybe an idea. If they trade pawns, then rook e1 check is going to be dangerous. And yeah, I think black's in a tough spot. I don't think they should trade pawns. I would be more scared if I was in black's shoes of opening up the e-file. So yeah, I was going to say, I think they should move the knight away. And then the question is what to do here. What to do here. So I can play bishop e5, but he does have bishop to d6. But then I think I have pawn takes e6, attacking the bishop on d7 and opening up my queen towards hitting the bishop on d6. So bishop e5, bishop d6, take e6. If he takes on e5, I take on d7 with check with the pawn, and then I think black is completely busted since the d7 pawn is forking the king and the rook. That looks very, very bad for black. If he takes back with the knight or the pawn, then I just win the bishop on d6. If he plays bishop takes b5, then I can take on d6, and then take on f4, and also take on f7. I think I have way too much, way too many good things going on there. So I think this wins material. I could have also, now that I'm looking at it, I could have also taken on d7. If the queen took, then I took on d6, and then I opened up the attack on the d6 bishop. But it might have been possible for black to take with the king, which looks really kind of silly. But if I take the pawn, then the king takes on e6, and maybe the king is able to protect the bishop on d6, oddly enough. I have a hard time believing that that would work. But I think taking e6 ends up getting the job done here. I think this ends up working. Because I don't really see how black defends against both of these threats. Bishop takes b5 is probably their best attempt. But then I'll still take on d6 and fork the queen and the knight. And then I'll take probably on f4. And even if they take on f1, I'll take with probably the king. I think I should have two minor pieces versus a rook. And I can also always throw in the move pawn takes f7 with check as well. But it would not surprise me if bishop takes, king takes, somehow was also very good. Pawn takes, king takes, or even pawn takes. Well, they can't take with the pawn, because I would take the knight. Yeah, this probably also works somehow, but I think what I'm doing here also gets the job done, so to speak. So bishop takes d6. The queen has to move, or at least I assume the queen moves. If the queen goes to c6, I have the move pawn takes f7, king takes, knight e5 check, forking the king and the queen. I think the queen has to go to b6 or a5 or something like that. It needs to avoid the c6 square. But again, I can always take on f7, weaken the king, take the knight on f4, check on e5. I think black is, generally speaking, in pretty bad shape. So he does actually end up going to c6, which I think is going to be catastrophic. We take on f7 with check. I think also if he had gone to b6, yeah, so here we check and we win the queen. And that is, for all intents and purposes, that looks like it's lights out. Is there a faster way than taking the queen to win? Queen g4 check, king takes bishop. I don't think I need to really calculate, quite honestly. I'll just take the queen. I'm also still threatening the knight. Okay, he gives the check. I think I'll just move the king, I guess. I don't really see what else I would do. Now I'll just move the bishop back to safety, I think. Yeah, I don't see why we don't just retreat to safety. I would like to play queen d5 check, but the knight covers that, so we retreat. There's no way really. Oh, he's going to take on g3 and then f1. That is possible. He could take g3 and then f1, but then if he tries knight c2, I do have queen to c4 check, forking the king, and forking the king and the knight on c2. So if he takes the rook and I take back, he is not able to play knight c2 afterwards. He could throw in rook d6 first, but then I would have queen g4 check. So here I'll take knight c2. I have the fork on c4. If he doesn't play knight c2, well, now it's a queen versus a rook. So now it's just about converting our material advantage. Let's go, I guess. I could go a3, hoping he plays knight c2, but he probably plays knight to d3. I'll just start with knight c3. I don't see any reason not to just focus on developing a new piece. Could have also checked on c4 first, but I can always kick the knight and then play knight on d5, queen on c4 check. Again, black is down 5 points in material, so easily winning position here. We just have to make sure we don't run out of time or anything crazy like that. Also, any checks on the h-file will always have the g1 square available. The only way we lose this is if somehow the knight ends up on e2 and the rook checks on the h-file, but there's really no feasible way of that happening here, quite honestly. He goes knight to d3. Rook d1, take f2, queen takes. My knight is protecting my rook. But I can also just start with knight to d5. I think I'll go for this. Maybe rook d1 first. I don't know if it really makes a huge difference. This being protected is very important because if my knight wasn't here, he could take on f2 and then win my rook, which would be bad news. I'm assuming he's going to play rook to d6. Yeah, so I thought he would do this. But I think now I'll just play the move knight to d5 to block off the file. I can also go knight to b5. But then he still has knight takes f2. So I need to block off this file. Now knight takes f2, queen takes f2, the knight on d5 is in the way. And I'm assuming he's going to move the knight backwards. After which, probably I'll play something like f4 and bring the queen in at the right time and continue attacking. He goes to b5. Okay, makes sense. I don't want to take on b4, of course, because I'd lose the rook. Think I can just check with the knight, though, and then trade. We check here. Trade the rooks afterwards. Bring the queen in. My king always has escape squares, so there's never any back rank mates to worry about. And I think we will be getting the job done pretty soon. Okay, we're going to take here. Then I will... guess I'll just bring the queen in. Threaten to take the pawn on c5. If check here, I have an escape square, and if check on h6, I again have an escape square. So the king is never in any trouble. b6. Guess I'll just go for a3 to kick the knight. Other moves might be good too, but I'm just going to kick the knight away and then put my knight back on the d5 square, or even play b4 and try to get rid of the c5 pawn. I think I'll go for that option. Let's do this. If he takes, I take. Then the knight has one less support square to sit on. If rook here, I have queen to e6 checkmate. Again, other moves might be good, but probably lots of ways to win the position. Could also play knight d3 check and then, you know, push the king backwards and push the f pawn. Lots of moves are good once again. Yeah, we're essentially just a queen versus a rook up. And an extra pawn up at the same time. We have 6 pawns to our opponent's 5, so as long as we don't do any super silly way of playing, we're going to be getting the job done. Now queen to d5 check, kick the king, and then take the knight is a big threat. Aside from also just threatening to take the c5 pawn. Moves the knight. There's no knight e2 or knight f3 checks. Those are covered. I can check here. Then just take the pawn. I guess that's simple enough. I can also just take the pawn right away. Now check, followed by taking the knight as a threat, since the knight would be unprotected. And if they take back, we take here with check. Probably check on d5 first. Maybe I should have checked first. That way the king... Yeah, I was going to say the king can take the pawn here. But I think we just have queen d5 checkmate, right? Queen to d5. I think that's just checkmate. Okay, so we get the job done. We get the win. Yeah, interesting game. Our opponent played pretty similarly to our first opponent in the video. However, he did deviate a little bit at kind of the late stage of the middle game. And I think we were able to get a pretty good position considering that he was behind on development and lacked that kingside castling option. And so, yeah, we'll move over to the game review and check it out there. All right, in the game review, we played at a 93.3% accuracy to our opponent's 81.1. Only one inaccuracy, it looks like. Otherwise, very solid game. So, game goes knight f3, knight f6, b3, c5, bishop b2, knight c6. Here I recommend the move e3. Because if black does play d5, we go for bishop b5 and we transpose into what we saw earlier in the first game. If black plays other moves, let's say they play e6, if they go for e6, I would play bishop to e2. And then if they go d5 now, then I would eventually play the move d4. And it would look somewhat similar to the game that we just had, except the difference is the bishop is on e2 instead of b5. So in that regard, there'd be some similar crossover ideas. Um, if black plays g6, we actually can take the knight on f6 potentially. Can take the knight and then play c4. This position is pretty interesting because you're trying to win control over the d5 square in the center of the board. So lots of interesting ways to play. Our opponent did play d5 though. We get the pin. They break the pin. Same exact stuff we saw in the very first game of the video. Castle. And then e6 was played. Taking the knight followed by e5 is definitely an option that's available here. But I actually wanted to go for this other way of playing, which is the move pawn to d4. And the idea here is that if black takes the pawn, we will take back with our pawn, eventually drop the bishop back to d3, develop the knight, play knight e5, play f4, and really just look to get a big attack over in the kingside direction. And the main trouble with black's position here is that the bishop on d7 has already blocked itself in with the e6 move, and so now these knight e5 ideas and bishop coming back to d3 makes a lot more sense at this point. If they had not played e6, then I would be less likely to play d4 is the main point. But after e6, we did d4, queen c7, c4, just put a lot of tension on the center of the board. Rook c8 ends up being a blunder. Maybe blunder is a little strong of a word, but it did start, the path for black to getting themselves into a lot of danger. I am happy to see that taking on d5 is the strongest move. I did mention during the game I was also thinking about taking on c5, but the computer does point out that black can take on c4 first, and then black is more or less okay here. So we take on d5 first. If the pawn had taken back, then we would take on c5, and then something like this would be very good for white. We're up a pawn, black's pawns are chopped up on the king side, and black's in bad shape. Instead, though, he took with the knight on d5. And yeah, also I'm happy to see that e4 is the best move. I thought about taking on c5 once again during the game. I thought that after bishop takes c5, I was kind of worried about this position. The computer says white is better, but yeah, there is even this idea of like sacrificing the bishop, and then rook takes g2, and knight takes e3, and this gets super duper scary. Like, the best move is king h1, you lose the bishop, and white is only better if they play queen to c1, trapping the rook, and okay, white's better, but this looked insanely scary in my mind, and I did not want to allow any of that funny business. I like the move e4 a lot more, knight f4, and then apparently g3 is even better. G3 first. Okay, interesting to note. I thought d5 was really good, and it is good, but black does have the move knight to d4 apparently. Only the move knight to d4 saves black. He did not do that. He played knight to b4, and then we made the fork. And then apparently taking on d7 is essentially just as good as taking on e6. I took on e6 first, but apparently you could take on d7. Black would have to take with the king. If they do take with the queen, you take on e6, and then black loses one of their two pieces. So they take with the king. And then apparently bishop takes f4, and then a3, and then g3. Oops, sorry, not h3, g3. And then I guess if the bishop goes back, you have e5. I think the way I played in the game may not be as precise as the computer points out, but I think it was simpler, quite honestly. It looked like I was just able to win material without too much of a fight. Yeah, he could try knight e2 check here. Maybe in hindsight this is what black should have done. Yeah, maybe this is the way to go. I did kind of forget that this was an option. But even here, once you move the queen away, knight to a3 attacking the bishop that's guarding the knight is really good, and black's in big trouble here. You're going to play pawn takes f7 and knight e5 check, and not a good position for black. He ended up moving the queen. We took on f7 with check. We made the fork. We won the queen. And pretty smooth sailing from here. Maybe there were other moves that were better. e5 apparently is better than bishop to g3. If he had tried the move knight to c2, we would have the move queen to c4 check to fork the king and the knight, so that doesn't work for black. And ultimately, we were just working on exchanging pieces, improving our pieces, going for some pawn breaks to open up the position. Black ended up walking into a checkmate. We got the job done. And yeah, so I think this was a really nice game, especially in regards to taking advantage of our opponent who was lacking in this kingside development. It may not seem like on the surface that a move like rook c8 can get black into so much trouble, but The biggest point here is they're lacking on that kingside development. They're not able to castle soon. And so we can take advantage of that by trading pawns and opening up the middle of the board, and eventually involving our very strong kind of Nemzo Larsen bishop, and that got us a big advantage and eventually got us the win. So that's it for our second game. Let's go ahead and get into our third game here. All right, we've got our third game here, playing our Ready Nemzo Larsen approach once again. We're playing against Eider 1989, rated 2156. I think this is Azerbaijan. Yeah, Azerbaijan. So knight f3, knight f6, we go b3. And we'll see what approach our opponent decides to go for. The other two opponents both played a combination of d5 and c5. This particular guy decides to kind of copycat us. We go bishop b2. He's going to go bishop b7. And in this kind of approach, in terms of where we develop our light square bishop, here I recommend going for g3 and bishop to g2. Playing e3 and developing the bishop along this diagonal doesn't make that much sense because there's no knight on c6, there's no pawn on d5, there's no pawn on c5. I think we should just go for kind of a double fianchetto approach. And we will decide what to do with the pawns on the king side or on the queen side in the near future. Pawn to g5 is a move I've never seen before in this position, and I have played this position quite a few times. Obviously their idea is to play g4 and attack the knight that's pinned, but it just seems very, very risky and very provocative. First things first, I could always take the knight and double up black's pawns and kind of worsen their structure. That looks pretty good, to be quite honest with you. I would really more so lean towards this if I could also somehow get the knight to the f5 square. So I could play h3. This is one option. I'm not really threatening to take the pawn, but later on down the road, the g5 pawn becomes a liability. I could play bishop g2, and then if he plays g4, play knight h4. Have the bishops get traded, and then the g4 pawn still kind of ends up being a liability in the long run, I think. And I'm kind of leaning towards that approach. I think h3 is fine, quite honestly, but it feels a little slow. And if your opponent's playing really funky, weird stuff, you usually want to try to punish it. h3 just feels like I'm just letting him play the move without any kind of repercussion. I think I'm going to go bishop g2, and if he goes g4, I'm playing knight h4 to protect the bishop on g2. If he does nothing about the pawn, I'm going to castle and eventually take the pawn if he doesn't defend it. He plays rook to g8. I think he's going to try to launch some full-out attack on the king side. I'm really not so sure. So if that's the case, I may not rush to castle the king. I think I'm just going to play a combination of c4 and d4 and grab the space in the center. I don't really see the whole point of this for black. So let's just go c4. I may take the knight in some... Yeah, I figured he was going to do this. So I do have to be a little bit careful here. So he could try to play h4. But if he plays h4, I have knight takes h4, don't I? Yeah, I don't think that works. h4, I can play knight takes h4. Not pawn takes h4, because then g4 would be a problem. I would not have the h4 square available for the knight. But if he plays h4, I can play knight takes h4, defending my bishop and attacking his. So I think I can just go for d4 or knight c3. I don't know if it really makes a huge difference which one I do. d4. If I get to play d5, like d4, d5, then I think black has a really rough position. So I think I'm going to go d4. And if he goes h4, I'm going to play knight takes h4. Okay, so I think he's just missing the tactical point here. So I'm going to take on h4 with the knight, protecting my bishop. If he takes with the pawn, I will take his bishop. We would be equal on pieces, but he would lose the rook in the corner of the board afterwards. Here, though, I recapture on g2, and now I'm just up a pawn. Just a free pawn, no h-pawn for him. My knight is a little awkward, sure, and I'm probably not going to castle kingside given the fact that the h-file's open, but now I'll just play moves like knight c3, e4, d5. I'll try to put all of my pawns on light squares because I am missing the light square bishop, and then that way my pawns will kind of coordinate and cooperate well with my bishop. Dark square bishop, and then pawns on the light squares. That way you kind of cover all of the squares on the board. So I might even just play d5 right away. I'm kind of leaning towards just doing that. Could also go h4 and just try to open up the h-file for my rook, and you know, that also looks reasonable as well. Honestly, I might just do that. If I go h4, I'm trying to open up my own rook. His rook is somewhat shut in on the g-file. My rook would be on this wide open h-file. So rather than him using that h-file, I can try to use it myself. So the question is, do I take with the knight or the rook? If I take with the knight, maybe he pins me, but it's really not that big of a deal. Kind of leaning towards taking with the knight. If I take with the rook, I'm not really so sure what the rook is doing from there, but it could become a target with some kind of bishop on e7, which is a little bit annoying. But also, if I take with the knight and he plays e6, it's not like my knight's moving forward anyways either. So I'm not really sure. Not really so sure. I think I'm going to take with the knight. I don't think there's anything wrong with using the rook, to be honest, but I think I'll take with the knight and go with that route of things. Okay, so I'm just going to continue developing. And most likely we're going to castle queenside. So knight c3, e3, e4, move the queen, castle queenside, and just, again, just be up a pawn with a great position. Let's go e4. Yep, don't see why not. Queen e2, castle. Yeah, we'll just go queen e2. I think he's going to castle queenside as well, which is totally fine. I could also play d5, that's another option as well, but let's just keep the pawns all side by side. Castle. Okay, we'll castle as well. He can throw in a check, but we'll just move the king, no big deal. Yeah, I'll just do the same thing. A little bit of copycat. But yeah, again, just up a pawn. He plays e6. I was actually kind of hoping he would play e5 so that I would have the f5 square available, but he plays e6, a little bit more restrictive. But maybe I can go d5 and kind of chip away at that e6 pawn a little bit. I really want to gain the f5 square for the knight, I think is what I would like to do. d5 does open up some squares for him, but it also opens up my bishop at the same time. So I'm gonna go with this approach. The knight on f5 would also make it so that the bishop on f8 pretty much can't move anywhere. That would be very nice. He plays bishop e7, okay. He doesn't want to move the pawn. That's reasonable. I think I can go knight to b5 and knight to d4 and kind of force him to do something about the pawn eventually. I can also... I was thinking queen f3, but knight e5 is kind of annoying. I think I will go knight to b5, put the knight on d4, and the knight on d4 will attack light squares, and the dark square bishop on b2 will hit dark squares. So once again, that's kind of the MO that we're thinking about here. So I want to get the knight to d4 and hit the e6 pawn. And see what he does about that. If he takes the knight, that's fine. I have the rook recapturing. No big deal. Yeah, let's just go here and attack the pawn. We're also threatening the fork, actually, now that I look at that. Yeah, we're threatening the fork, which is a huge problem as well. I actually kind of forgot that that was available, but not only are we threatening e6, but we're also threatening knight c6. Not only forking the king and the rook, but also hitting that bishop at the same time. Okay, he goes that route, but he just loses the e6 pawn as far as I can tell, right? I can go knight c6, he plays rook e8. I think I'm just going to take the pawn, though. And once the e6 pawn is gone, then I can bring the knight to the f5 square, which is still a big thing that's good for me. So rook e8, I assume. Knight goes to f5. Takes on h4. If I take on d8, he'll take back with the bishop, and then he'll have two pieces for the rook, which I don't think is exactly what I want. I will go this route. And then if he plays rook e8, I'll just take the knight on g4. I'm not only attacking the rook, but also the knight. No good way to guard both. He saves the knight, but he loses the rook. Then I can play a move like f4, just kicking the knight backwards. depending on where the knight goes, maybe I go rook h8 to trade off the rooks on the back rank. Goes knight to g6. Okay, I will go rook h6 to attack that knight. I can also go for pawn to e5 to open up the d file, which looks pretty good. My king will always be super safe in the corner of the board. No big issues there. Do I go rook h8 and offer the trade of rooks? Looks fine. Rook h7 also looks perfectly good. I think I'll go rook h7. Oh, I need to be a little bit careful about somehow moving my queen away and losing this pawn. He offered me a draw, but I'm obviously not taking that. Let's just go rook h8. I think I'll just play it simple here. Trade the rooks. Almost always a good idea just to trade when you're ahead. He'll try to attack this pawn with something like knight c5. Here, I can go e5. I can also just go rook to e1. I think I'll just do that. Let's go rook e1, guard the pawn, and then bring the bishop back and try to trade more pieces. That's the game plan. Little bit of safe play here to consolidate our advantage. Let's go here to attack the knight. Then probably I can just go here to attack the other knight. He'll go to c6. Here I think I can do something like queen to d2, and then put the queen on the d5 square. Looks fine. Queen to d5 will attack both the knights and pin the one on c6. He'll probably play queen f8. I can always bring the bishop back to c3 and then play it like that. Okay, let's go queen to d5 to pin the knight. Don't see any reason not to do that. And then probably I'll just start pushing the e-pawn. I also need to start pushing to make a pass pawn. e5 there is queen f5, which is, I will say, a little bit annoying. Maybe I'll play something... Oh, he goes queen to d7. Okay, well now I will go e5. And I'll just work on pushing. If this knight moves, I'll trade queens happily. Otherwise, I'll just push the e-pawn down the board. Okay, happy to trade the queens. Push the pawn. Push the pawn. Okay, now we are just up a piece. Well, up a 4 rook, actually. I'm also restricting his knight from moving. I can play a move like b4, which is kind of funny, looking to continue restricting the knight, but I can also just push the g-pawn down the board. Nothing he can really do about that. g6. Here I'll just move the bishop away, give a discovered check. He has to move back to the d file, and then push the g-pawn down the board. He ends up resigning, and we get the win here. Okay, so I think this was a relatively straightforward game. He played some really weird stuff with g5 and rook g8 and h5. And you can see here that even a player at like the 2100 rating level is breaking opening principles in a very odd way, quite honestly. And we were able to punish that. So let's go over to the game review and we'll check it out there. All right, we played at a 92.1% accuracy, had 1 inaccuracy in the game, 1 brilliant. Where was the brilliant? It must have been the knight takes h4 move, right? I'm going to assume that was the brilliant move. But okay, we'll check it out. So knight f3, knight f6, b3, b6. Both players develop their bishops. And it's a very balanced position. This position is totally fine for black, totally fine for white. And then black plays this kind of crazy g5 move, which I've never seen before. I don't know if he mouse slipped. Given the moves he played in the game, I highly doubt it was a mouse slip. I think he was obviously hoping I would take the pawn. I just decided to break the pin. I also mentioned that h3 was playable, or bishop takes f6. The computer also says those moves are fine, but I thought bishop g2 looked good enough. Rook went to g8. Apparently taking on f6 right away is the strongest move. You could take on f6 here, and then play a move like c4. And yeah, black's pawn structure is pretty bad. The f5 square is weak. Maybe we maneuver the knight. Yeah, I did mention taking the knight on f6 a few times during the game, but I never really found the best place to do it. Apparently it was good to go for here, but yeah, I just decided to play c4 instead. I guess once again you could take it. I went for d4. His best move is g4. he played h4. I was almost positive that he was going to play h4 after he played h5. And what he's really hoping for is that if I take the pawn, he's going to get to play g4. And now my knight is actually lost. I do not have knight to h4 available because my bishop would be well, because my pawn's in the way, of course. And now I would just lose a piece. So he's also threatening h3 at the same time. Like if I do nothing, knight c3, he can play h3 and then g4. And I'm sure against a lesser opponent, this type of tricks and traps probably do work for you know, a fair amount of the time. But I had already kind of predicted that he might play h4, and I already knew that h4 didn't work because we have this nice knight takes h4 idea, opening up the discovered attack on his bishop on b7, winning a pawn in the process, and now his entire attack on the king side is completely gone. I went for h4, got the knight on h4. Computer prefers rook takes h4 a tiny bit more, but not a huge difference. Focus on developing, protecting our stuff, get the king a little bit safe. And as I mentioned, I played d5, mostly trying to focus on controlling the light squares with my pawns, and that way they kind of complement the bishop. The bishop is on the dark squares, the pawns are on the light squares. Apparently e5 was even better. I didn't really think about that during the game very much, but e5, knight moves, you know, f3, knight moves, pawn takes, g4. I guess white is also still significantly better here as well, which is not much of a surprise. But I decided on d5. He went bishop e7, knight went to b5. I wanted to get the knight to the d4 square. And now black's in big trouble because how does he stop the fork and guard the e6 pawn at the same time? He just doesn't really have a great way to do it. He played king a8. He ended up losing the pawn. We took back on h4, and now the rook is hit, the knight's hit. He's losing more material. Even if he tries to play rook to e8 to counterattack my knight, I can just take his. He can't take my knight because the rook would hang. And if he trades rooks, then I'm also protecting my knight at the same time. So simply put, he's just losing material here. Lost the exchange. We traded off the rooks, make a little bit of defensive moves, make the pin. And then as I've talked about in plenty of other videos, when you're ahead material, especially if it is like an extra pawn or you have the ability to make a pass pawn, that's one of your most straightforward plans in the later stages of a game. Just make a pass pawn and just push it down the board. And that's exactly what I do here. You know, I don't need to play rook h1 and rook h8 and try to mate him or something. I mean, maybe those moves are also good, no doubt about it. But the most straightforward plan is just to push the e-pawn. Push, capture, trade, push, push. It costs black a piece. And then what do we do right after that? We just push the other pawn. g4, g5, g6. If I go g7, he'll play king f7, so I move the bishop away and gave a check first. Once he moves the king, then I'll push, make the queen, and the game is also obviously over at this point. Yeah, so 3 different games here in this video against players all above the rating of 2100 on chess.com and the rapid rating pool, playing already Nimzo Larsen and getting some good games here. So if you're wanting to look more into this particular opening repertoire, playing the ready Nimzo Larsen in your own games, for instance, right now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, Chessable is in the midst of a sale that they're running right now on chessable.com. My course, the Ready Nimzo Larsen Attack, is one of those courses that's on sale. The link to the course will be in the description box below the video. So if you're interested in checking out that course, there's pretty much no better time to check it out because you get a nice discount on the course, which is always a nice thing. And you can maybe get it as a gift for a family member or a friend or something that's into chess as well. Anyways, though, that's going to do it for this video. If you do want to see any of the other episodes of the speedrun series where I play more games with the Ready Nimzo Larsen opening, you can check that out to the left of the video here with the playlist. That'll do it for this video, though. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'll see you around the next one.